Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for tonight's program, Girl with Two Landscapes, the Wartime Diary of Lena Jedwab, 1941 to 1945, with Dorothee Rozenberg. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's 2023 Great Jewish Books Club. Before we get started, a few things to note. Your video and audio will be off throughout the program. You may send us questions via the question panel at the lower right. We ask that you keep questions short and refrain from comments so that we can try to get to all of your questions this evening. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's presenter, Dorothee Rozenberg. Dorothee is the daughter of Lena Jedwab Rozenberg. She was born in Paris and raised in a Yiddish-speaking home. She has a master's in English and studied Yiddish with Yitzhak Naborsky and Rachel Ertel in Paris in the 1980s. She attended the Columbia Yiddish Summer Program in 1985, was a YIVO Fellow in New York from 1985 to 1987, and was part of the first group of summer interns at the Yiddish Book Center in 1986. She has worked in publishing and as a technical translator for English into French, and she's currently working on translating her mother's works into English. It's a pleasure to welcome you, Dorothee.
Thank you, Lisa. I'm delighted to be here and to present my mom's diary.
Great. Thank you.
So I will start by actually reading the first entry in the diary. Wednesday, the 8th of October, 1941, 10 o'clock in the morning. The irony of fate. Did I ever dream that I would be so far from home in a remote village in Udmurtia, that I would be the ward of a children's home, part of a collective of children who are strangers to me, all alone in a foreign land. In a foreign land, what a cruel sound. How much it means to a person. Now, nearing the end of the 17th year of my life, with my body in full bloom and full of energy, love of life, and the joy of youth, the year is dirty, muddy, in sleepy Sarapul. My days pass in idleness, in unending sorrow and yearning for home. Is home really a cot in the communal dormitory, my satchel, notebooks, and books that lie orphaned, waiting for the school year to start? No, my home is there, on the other side of the front, in Bialystok. I recall my street, the old house, my mother. Mama, where are you now? My home? It's you. It's Sorele, Moishele, Papa, my friends. Where are Sorele Davidovsky, Moishe, Leike, Zavel, Moishel, Shionke, Chaim, Herschel, Shloime, Nyonke? My home is my school, my teachers. My home is Bialystok. I'm going to now share my screen with you. So my mother, Lena Rozenberg, was born Lena Jedwab on November 30th, 1924 in Bialystok. So the leftmost picture is the earliest picture we have of Lena. She's about 14. It's at some kind of family function. And all her life, she bemoaned the fact that she's hiding her mother. This is the only picture she had of her mother, and she couldn't really see her because she was hiding her. The picture in the center, she's about 19 years old. And on the picture on the right, which was taken at my wedding in 1993, she is about 80 years old. Lena was the oldest of 3 children. Her father was a shoemaker. Her family was very poor. Starting at age 6, she attended a Yiddish secular school, a Tzisho school, Central Yiddish School Organization, where she excelled. To help her family, she started tutoring younger students when she was only 10 years old. She was interested in theater from an early age and acted in school plays. At home, she spoke Yiddish, but she also learned Polish and later on Russian. Growing up, she belonged to a communist young pioneer organization, and she went to meeting. Her mother always worried that they would all go to jail because those meetings were illegal. Bialystok was an industrial city. The main industry was textile, but there were also sawmills. There was a big Jewish community. Most Jews lived in the town, and the non-Jewish Poles lived in the outskirts. A lot of Poles actually knew Yiddish, so they could do business with the Jews who worked in various trades. Leah's grandparents were relatively wealthy. Her grandfather owned a workshop for building materials, but her grandmother died young when her mother was still a child, and her grandfather fell apart and lost a lot of his businesses. So her mother, Friederike, ended up living with her oldest sister, who was much older than her. And at the time Friederike started living with her, she already had 5 children. In time, her sister had 10 children, and Friederike helped take care of them. Leah's mother wanted Leah to become a seamstress, but my mother had absolutely no interest, and she only wanted to study, possibly to become a teacher. But her mother didn't think that that would be a good path for her, because she was afraid she would end up as an old maid. Nazi Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. The Germans took over Poland in 8 days, but as part of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, they gave the eastern part of Poland to Russia, which means that Bialystok became part of the Soviet Union, and Bialystok residents became Soviet residents. On June 22nd, 1941, when Germany invaded Russia, Leah was working as a camp counselor in Druskinik, which was a resort town then and still is today. Then it was part of Poland, now it's part of Lithuania. The summer camp was a communist camp, as fictionalized in the short story called Miro, which precedes the diary. When the war broke out, the director of the summer camp wanted to bring the kids back to Bialystok, but the railroads had been bombed, so they couldn't go back. So instead, the director, who had communist ties, took the children further east into the Soviet Union, and further until he found a place for them in Karakulina in the Udmurtia Republic near the Ural Mountains. The summer camp effectively turned into an orphanage where the children continued their education. So here on the top left, you see a map that shows you where Bialystok is, where the summer camp in Druskinik was, and where she ended up in Karakulino. So they got there by train. And to the right, you have a picture of the orphanage. Lena is circled in red. And then in the bottom left, there is an award that Leah got when she was going to school there, with a picture of Stalin and Lenin. During a class that I took at YIVO last semester, there was a student from Russia who said that the fact that there was a picture of Stalin and Lenin meant that she was really a good student. So once in Russia, Leah became known as Lena, which was the Russian equivalent of her name. And that is the name that she kept for the rest of her life. So she stayed in the orphanage in Karakulino until she turned 18. And in Karakulino, she studied German. And by age 17, as demonstrated in her diary, she could quote from Heine in German, she could quote from Polish authors in Polish, and she could quote from Russian authors in Russian. As she was abruptly separated from her family, Lena kept a diary throughout the war. At the orphanage, the children had to speak Russian, but Lena wrote her diary in Yiddish as a way of maintaining her connection with her Mameloshen, her mother tongue, as well as her culture. I will now read another entry from the diary. Friday, the 28th of November, 1941, 11 o'clock in the morning, during a class on Darwinism. It's half a year already that I'm away from home. Half a year in which I haven't seen a Yiddish book, newspaper, or journal. I long for Yiddish literature, to see Yiddish in print, It seems to me that I've already forgotten the literary language. At times, I have to struggle to translate an easily understood Russian word into Yiddish. How annoying that is. The thought that I may have to spend long years in this environment, that I'll forget Yiddish more and more, makes me very sad. So she didn't really know what had happened to her family. Later, she found out that her mother and sister had died in Treblinka and that her father and brother had been shot, and that she was the only surviving member of her family. When Lena turned 18, she aged out of the orphanage, and so she decided to go to Moscow to continue her education. She spent one summer working in the fields to earn enough to move to Moscow. Friday, the 9th of July, 1943. My life working in the fields is becoming more stressful by the day. Despite the fact that I treat the tractor's drivers very well, greet them with a friendly word and a smile, they treat me badly. First of all, they think that I don't do anything. Doling out and measuring the fuel for everyone, writing it down, that's not work. Second, it's because I'm Jewish. Who says there is no anti-Semitism here? Third, because I wash my hands before eating and eat with my own spoon. Most important of all, because unlike the female tractor drivers, I won't let them embrace me. True, not all of them behave badly. There are two hateful creatures here, boys of 14 and 15. Just now, they tore down a chart from the wall, which is very important for my work, and smoked it instead of cigarettes. Already twice, they've poured machine oil in my cup. They curse constantly, Jew, Jew. Because of this, my work becomes all the more difficult. But I strain every nerve in order to persevere. I have to earn bread from my studies at any cost. So she started at the Polytechnic Institute in Moscow, but she was stymied by the technical drawing classes. So she switched to language and literature and majored in German. But after a while, she felt alienated by the growing anti-Semitism and decided to go back to Poland. She settled in Lodz, where she went to the university. Here is her student card from the University of Lodz. And she also worked for the Polish embassy in the office looking for displaced persons. And that's how she met Sholem Rozenberg, who was searching for his older brother, Ksil, who had been interned in a gulag. So Sholem Rozenberg, my father, was born in Warsaw on November 11th, 1918, the end of World War I, which is why his name was Sholem, peace. On the left here, you see a picture of him with his parents and two of his sisters. He's about, I think, probably 14 in this picture. And this picture always reminded me of the picture that's on the cover of the collection of Jewish stories. If you see on the wall there, there's a picture of traditional Jewish couple, and they look like my grandparents on this picture. Anyway, the picture in the middle was probably taken when he was in his mid-20s, and the picture on the right was taken when he was 80. So Sholem was the youngest of 6 children. His father was a shoemaker, and his family was so poor they couldn't even afford to pay the rabbi at the cheder, the Jewish school. And so my father stopped going because he got embarrassed when, he would go to the rabbi and he didn't have the money to pay him. But he was very curious, and he taught himself to read both in Yiddish and in Polish. And then for 5 years, while he had already started working, he went to night school. He was very active in the Bund, the Jewish socialist movement, and he loved classical music. When the war broke out in 1939, the mayor of Warsaw ordered all young people to leave the city. Sholem went east and worked in Volkovitz for a while. But at some point, he had to register as a Russian citizen, and he didn't want to because he didn't want to risk being drafted in the Russian army. So at that point, he was put in prison and then taken into a Russian labor camp in Vorkuta near the Arctic Circle. So here is where the Vorkuta labor camp was. So he spent the war in the Soviet Union and returned to Poland afterwards. There was nothing for him in Warsaw. I mean, the city had pretty much been, razed to the ground. His parents died, his father most likely in the Warsaw Ghetto, and his oldest sister and her family and his mother probably were deported to Treblinka, although I'm not sure about that. So he went to Lodz. It seems like Lodz was a very active Jewish center after the war. And a mutual friend introduced him to Lena because he was looking for his oldest brother, and Lena was able to help him. So she helped him find his brother, Ksil, and they got close. So this on the left is a picture of Ksil shortly after he left the Gulag. And on the right, there's a picture of Shalom, Ksil, and Lena. So Shalom and Lena fell in love, got married, and decided to leave Poland in 1947. They stopped in Warsaw briefly, where they attended the dedication of the Warsaw Ghetto Heroes Monument on April 19th, 1948. So they left Poland illegally. They went through Czechoslovakia and Vienna, and they arrived in Paris on September 20th, 1948, and they were granted asylum in France. Lena was pregnant, and she gave birth to my brother shortly after in November. They didn't know French. My father didn't have any work, so he asked around, what do they need? They said tailor, so my father became a tailor. His two surviving sisters moved to Israel, while Ksil and his other brother, Menashe, moved to Paris. However, Menashe died in 1961, and I never knew him. Shortly after they arrived in Paris, and after my mom had my brother, she got sick with tuberculosis, and she was sent to a sanatorium for an entire year. Here on the left, you see her at the sanatorium. During that time, my brother was left with a wet nurse. When Lena got back from the sanatorium, Sholem got sick, and so he had to spend 6 months in the same sanatorium. And on the right is a picture of them at the sanatorium. So the first few years in France were very hard, but little by little, they made a living. Their first apartment was small, didn't have running water. There was a bathroom outside on the landing. At first, Sholem worked for a boss, but at some point he took work home, and he was, working at the sewing machine 14 hours a day. They had 2 more children, my sister and me. After some years, Sholem opened his own wholesale tailor shop, and they moved to a bigger apartment where I was born. Lena helped him at the shop. From the beginning of their time in Paris, they became involved with the Madame Library and the Albertering, the workers' circle, and they were very active contributors to the Yiddish cultural life in Paris. Their circle included writers such as Avram Sutzkever, Dorothee Rozenberg, who actually reviewed the Yiddish edition of Lena's diary, Mordechai Lidwin, and painters like David Dushinsky, Yossel Bergner, and the Yiddish intelligentsia such as Marek Edelman, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or Yossel Mlotek. Here on the left is a picture of Marek Edelman at our house with my father sometime in the 1970s. And on the right, a picture of my mother in her favorite armchair, reading a book, her favorite activity. Lena also recited poetry often at the Madame Library. She organized literary evenings, and she occasionally contributed literary reviews to the Yiddish Paris newspapers. The house was filled with books, mostly in Yiddish, but also in Polish, in Russian, in French. And every painting in the house was done by somebody they knew personally. Here is Lena reciting at the Madame Library. The man on her left on both pictures is Mordechai Litvin, who was a poet and a translator who translated French poets into Yiddish. In 1983, Lena provided the female voice on a series of audio tapes of Yiddish language audio tapes, Shalom Yiddish, that was created by Yitzhak Niborsky and Devorah Kosman. When I was studying at the Columbia Summer Yiddish program in '85, there was one day when I was studying in my room with my door open, and I thought I heard my mom's voice, and I was like really confused. I was thinking, well, what is she doing in New York? And then I realized that one of my fellow students was using the audio tapes to study. Lena also wrote poetry and started a novel set in Paris after the war, but she never finished it. She was the one with the most formal education of my parents. My father was largely self-taught. But because she stopped short of getting her master's in Russia, and also she was very cagey about talking about her years in Russia, because after the war, it was the Cold War, and it wasn't, she was worried about her communist past, even though she got very disillusioned with communism, but still she didn't feel comfortable with talking about that part of her life. And also the French educational system is very rigid, and it wouldn't have been easy for her to transfer her credits and resume her education. Besides that, she was also very insecure, and she never showed her work to anybody. Ironically, the only reason we got to read her diary was because she got sick. She was mostly known in Paris for her skills reciting poetry in a very Soviet emphatic style. So here, there's only one tape of my mom reciting at the Medem Library, and it was a program on December 5th, 1992. She was already sick then, but I still think that seeing her recite gives you a flavor for her skills. And because she's reciting in Yiddish, I put a translation of the poem so you can see what the poem is about. The poem is called Die Meise mit der Welt by Moshe Leib Halpern.
Ich befehl, wir soll einnehmen die Welt, hat der König gesagt. Ist das Land gewollt geworden davon? Hat die Mame ihr lebendigen Sohn wie ein ähnlichen Teuten beklopft. Aber das Ackereisen im Feld und die Säulen unter dem Schuss der Hammer und die Mäuse im Kammer haben Stillerheit gelacht. Wenn wir uns in die Psure gebracht, die dosige finstere Psure. Jetzt hat mir schon eingenommen die Welt. Wo soll man tun mit ihr? Sie kann nicht rein in den Königsstoß. Man hat vergessen zu nehmen am Osten der Welt, wenn man hat gemacht wie Tier. Aber das Ackereisen im Feld und die Säule unter dem Schuss des Hammer und die Mäuse in Kammer, da können sich vergelächter scheuen. Sie zittert Asch bei dem König die Kräuen und der verscheit Gelächter. Die Häuflein meinen, die Welt soll derweil aber wachte in Preußen stehen. Nur der König ist wieder Teut, so blass. Hat Meure, die Welt kann noch werden nass, wenn es Wetterregen geht. Aber das Ackereisen im Feld und die Säulen unter dem Schuss des Hammer und die Mäuse in Kammer lachen so, als es sich schon erschreckt. Sie starben schier vor die Gelächter weg, was die Welt steht noch als in Größen.
In 1989, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, my parents took a trip to Russia, where my mom reunited with the director of the orphanage and some of her classmates, most of whom had become academics. While they never regretted moving to France, it is clear to me she could have had an academic career given different circumstances. Growing up, I had always seen my parents as poor immigrants who spoke French with an accent, was their fifth language, and were blue-collar workers who didn't have much standing in French society. So I was surprised to discover when I studied Yiddish in New York that they were well regarded among the Yiddish intelligentsia. When the highly acclaimed Yiddish poet Avraham Sutzkever came to visit our class at YIVO in 1987, everybody was in awe. But I went up to him, introduced myself as Lena and Sholom's daughter, and he gave me a big hug. I hadn't realized he was such a public figure. To me, he was just one of my parents' friends whom I had seen in my parents' living room. When my father sold his tailor shop and retired in 1985, he started volunteering at the Madame Yiddish Library in Paris, where he worked until his death at age 96. Anybody in the Yiddish world who spent any time in Paris knows and remembers him. For instance, last month, my husband and I went to Poland, and in Warsaw, we met with one Karolina Szymianski, who teaches Yiddish at university. And she mentioned she had been in Paris. And when I mentioned my father, she said, of course, she knew him. She'd been to visit him many times. And similarly, a couple of weeks ago, we went to the Yiddish Book Center for Bialystok and had a chance to hear Eleanor Weil, a French Yiddish singer and musician. And she also knew my father from her time in Paris. In 1988, Lena had a heart attack and underwent triple bypass surgery. In the following months, following the surgery, she started exhibiting dementia. So my father encouraged her to copy her diary by hand to help jog her memory. Well, we had heard about the diary growing up. She had never let any of us, including my father, read it. I actually thought it was written in Russian because she always referred to it as her Russian diary. But Lena continued to decline. And at some point, my father had to take over. So he had the diary typed up and he self-published it in Yiddish in Paris in 1999. And then he approached me and suggested that I try getting it published in the States because I had worked in publishing. So I took up the project. And in the center, you see the original Yiddish edition. On the bottom left, you see the first American edition, which was published in 2002. In the bottom right, you see the French edition that was published in 2012. On the top right, you see the Russian edition that came out in 2019. And then on the top left, the diary was excerpted in a German anthology that came out last year, and Lena's picture is on the top left. So the English edition was translated by Sholom Beinfeld, who's a Yiddish translator and the co-editor-in-chief of the Yiddish English Dictionary. The foreword was written by Irina Klepfish, and the introduction by Jan Gross. And as you know, the English edition was republished this year by White Goat Press at the Yiddish Book Center. Even though Sholom Beinfeld, the translator, lives in Cambridge, it was actually my father who introduced me to him because he had met him in Paris. Sholom's translation perfectly captured my mother's voice, even though my mom never spoke English. And he also brought his historical knowledge to bear and added many footnotes that really illuminate the necessary historical and political background to Lena's diary. For the cover of the book, my father chose a painting by the preeminent Israeli painter Yossel Bergner. That painting used to hang in my parents' living room. And Yossel was a friend of my father's for 84 years. The original title of the diary was Von Heim zu Navenad, which translates in English as From Home to Wandering. But I thought that that didn't really translate well in English. So for the title of the English edition, I actually chose the title of the painting because I thought that it perfectly captures the duality between the inner landscape symbolized by Yiddish and the outer landscape symbolized by Russian. So Yassel, as you can see on this slide, was a close friend of my parents. On the top left, you can see him visiting with us when I was like about 10 years old. I'm the girl with the pigtails and the glasses. And then on the top right, there's a picture of my family in Israel visiting him in his studio in 2012. On the bottom left, there is a drawing that he made at our house in 1949. It's a drawing of the character Bonche Schweig from I.L. Peretz's short stories. And on the bottom right, there is the drawing that he sent my husband and me as a response to the announcement we sent him of our wedding. And so we ended up using this drawing as the invitation for a party in Paris. And in the bottom center, there is the drawing that he sent back when we sent him an announcement of my daughter's birth. And so I framed that one. He would come to Paris often. And one time he even borrowed my watercolors and made a drawing right there on the spot. Lena died in 2005, and my father died in 2015. One of the classrooms of the Yiddish Paris Cultural Center, the Maison de la Culture Yiddish, is named after them. When my siblings and I emptied our parents' apartment, we found many more of Lena's writings, including a notebook in which she tells the story of her mother life, and it covers from roughly 1900 to 1926. We found her unfinished novel set in Paris after the war, and most likely autobiographical, as well as all the letters that Lena and Sholem exchanged when they were in the sanatorium. I have started translating these materials in English, mostly for my children, but also because I think that they have historical significance, and hope to get help in this project from the Yiddish Book Center. While my parents spoke Yiddish at home, my siblings and I answered them in French. But I did, absorb Yiddish pretty much by osmosis in France. And later on, I formally studied it when I got to university. I wrote my master's thesis about Jewish American women writers and started a PhD studying Jewish American women who wrote in English versus those who wrote in Yiddish. At the time, I participated in the Columbia Yiddish Summer Program in '85, was a YIVO Fellow from '85 to '87, and was part of the first batch of summer interns at the Yiddish Book Center in 1986. While I didn't complete my PhD, I always kept my interest in Yiddish, and in particular in Yiddish women writers. I have carried my mother's legacy by helping publish her wartime diary in America and other countries. The lullaby I sang my children was a Yiddish lullaby my father sang me. I've been involved in the Boston Workers Circle, and my kids grew up in that community as well. For a few years, all four of us sang in the Boston Workers Circle Community Yiddish Chorus, A Bessere Welt. Here you can see my family and I with Adrian Cooper in 2011 when the Yiddish chorus A Bessere Welt did a concert commemorating the Shirtwaist Triangle factory fire. And on the right is a picture of me from the Packenträger when I was a summer intern at the Yiddish Book Center. My Jewish identity is rooted first and foremost in Yiddish. This past May, my husband and I went to Poland, and when we were in Warsaw, we visited the Jewish cemetery. And there's an area with a mass grave for the people who died in the Warsaw Ghetto. In all likelihood, my grandfather is buried there. And near there was a plaque with a poem by a Yiddish poet, Yitzhak Katznelson, and Song of the Murdered People, Das Lied von dem ausgehärgeten jiddischen Volk. The guide read the English version, but I felt it should be read in Yiddish. So she said, well, you should read it. So I started reading it, and as I did so, I realized that this was a poem that my mom used to recite at the Medem Library at the occasion of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising anniversary. And I could hear her voice in my head, and I got very choked up and I barely made it through. But I felt that this was the best way I could honor my parents' legacy and my mom's love of Yiddish. So Lena's diary provides a unique perspective on the survival of Eastern European Jews who ended up, for various reasons, in the Soviet Union. While there have been many books written about concentration camps and ghettos and about Jews who escaped to the West, far less has been written about Jews who escaped to the East, which, as we learned during our recent trip to Poland, is pretty much the only way that Eastern European Jews survived the war. So Lena's diary shines a light on this lesser known aspect of Holocaust survival and provides an important testimony about surviving the war in the East. Thank you. I will now take questions.
Dorothee, thank you so much. What an amazing presentation. I mean, the book in of itself, I have to say, is an incredible document and story. But your life immersed in Yiddish is fascinating. I think there are about 10 other programs to be had out of this. So thank you in advance of asking you all these questions. So, and I'm terrible with pronunciation. So is Jedwab related? Jedwab? Okay.
Yes.
To Jedwab, Jedwabne, were Jews were pogromed after the war. Do you know anything about that connection to the town? Oops. Dorothee, I think you're, oh, there we go.
Okay. Yeah, no, I just was saying that the name Jedwab means silk in Polish, and I don't believe there's a connection with Jedwabne, the city.
Were there any known family members living in other countries? And if so, were they in Bialystok getting news of what was happening from outside sources?
So basically, the only surviving members of my mother's family are a distant cousin whose family left before the war. So she actually that she talks about that in the interview that is available from the Wexler Oral History Project. The interview was done by her cousin Aubrey Palestrand, and Aubrey's mother and grandmother, who lived in Bialystok, left before the war and moved to South Africa. Because they moved to South Africa, they survived. As far as we know, all the members of the family who remained in Bialystok died. And we don't really know what kind of information they had, although my mother says that after the war, she went back to Bialystok and met some friends who said that her mother thought my mother was dead, because when the war broke out, they tried to find out what had happened in Druskenik, and they heard reports that the children had died. And so her mother thought my mother was dead. And my mom didn't really get any news until pretty much the end of the war and didn't really know what had happened to anybody.
Do you think that perhaps writing in Yiddish allowed her to keep her diary private?
It's possible, although there were quite a few other children who were in the orphanage who were also Jews and knew Yiddish. But I'm sure it provided her with some measure of privacy, although I really don't think that that was the main goal. I think her main goal was really to keep that connection to her sense of self.
This is a fun little question. I'm curious if your dad made all of your clothes while you were growing up.
My father actually made leather jackets. So yes, every leather jacket anybody in the family ever wore were made by him. And there was even one year when he asked everybody what color, we wanted, and asked for purple. So he made me a purple leather jacket. He also made my guitar case. And once he even made me a black leather miniskirt.
So it was a very fun question. Thank you out there for asking. Interested in the various titles for the diary in the different translations.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the Yiddish title was somewhat difficult to translate. And so I like the title of the painting, which worked well for the English edition. The French edition, Sans feu ni lieu, really means sort of rootless wandering. I think it captures the pretty well. And as for the Russian edition, well, let's see. I think the Russian is probably closer. Yeah, agonized. The Russian edition pretty much says from home to wandering. It's more literal.
Could you repeat the name of the painter of the book cover?
Oh, yes, of course. Yossel Bergner, Bergner.
Was that Russian anti-Semitism promoted by the Soviet government?
I don't know if it was actively promoted, but it was certainly rampant. And my mom, who started out as a real idealist communist, got gradually disillusioned with communism and was very bitter because she really believed in it, and she started experiencing the anti-Semitism herself personally, but also when she was at the university. I think the reason she left Moscow is because I think one of her professors was targeted and she felt it was time to leave. And it's a good thing she did, because at some point, all the famous Yiddish, writers were exterminated. So that was a good move on her part.
The anthology in German that was pictured, is your mother's diary included in full, or is it abridged?
No, it's excerpts. It's an anthology that has various excerpts from several diarists.
What was it like being a Jew in Paris after the war? How were Jews treated by that culture at large? And was the Shoah discussed by anyone other than Jews?
Well, right after the war, I can't really say. I mean, I was born in 1963. Growing up, I never really, I think one time when I was in second grade, somebody called me a dirty Jew. The rest of the time, I didn't really feel particularly targeted, but I did feel very different. I mean, French is a very sort of, even though there's a secular culture, by and large, the culture is Catholic culture. So I was the only kid, didn't go to school on Yom Kippur or things like that. And my parents felt very different to it than, because they were immigrants, especially because there's a sort of a gap in generation. Most people whose parents were survivors tended to be third generation, and I'm second generation. There's a big age difference between me and my brothers. There's 14 years, and my parents had me late. So I always felt a little offset, by having parents who looked like they could be my grandparents and who spoke with an accent. And, I didn't particularly feel anti-Semitism, but I certainly didn't feel, I stuck out. Also, my name, Rozenberg, really marked me as Jewish very clearly. And it's only when I arrived in New York where I suddenly blended in, Dorothee Rozenberg. In French, some of my teachers had a hard time pronouncing my last name. I don't think it's particularly difficult, but they, it didn't feel natural to them.
Were these Jewish children at the orphanage in danger at any point during the war?
No, I think they were pretty safe. And I think that the orphanage didn't just have Jewish kids. I think it had Jewish kids and Polish kids and Lithuanian kids. But I think that they were very safe there. I mean, the conditions weren't great because it was the war, but all things considered, I think they were pretty safe.
Let's see if I can shorten this one a little bit. My mother had a similar initial journey same as your mother. She was also born in 1924 in Lithuania and was in Vilnius attending university when the war started. So that separated her from her family. Parents met in the Lodz DP camp, and I'll just skip to the end of the question. What made your parents decide, if you know what did, to stay in France and even return to Poland? My parents didn't want anything to do with Poland after the war.
Well, so I think my parents initially went back to Poland because they were looking for survivors. I mean, they didn't really know. So I think they went back and they looked for, my father was looking for his oldest brother. My mom, was, they went back to just see what was the situation. Now, why did they decide to go to France rather than somewhere else? Like, they weren't Zionists, so they wouldn't have gone to Israel, even though my father's two sisters did go to Israel, and they wouldn't have been able to go to America because they had tuberculosis. But I think my mom especially really looked at France as, the country of, enlightenment and literature and culture and, liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, and brotherhood. So I don't think they ever regretted staying in France. There was a pretty important Jewish community in Paris, and there was a workers' circle, there was a Yiddish library. I mean, my father basically said that, he felt very lost when he got to Paris. He didn't speak the language. He, didn't have any skills. And then the day he found the Madame Library, he felt, okay, I'm home. And they didn't need, any more than that. But they had friends who moved to Israel. They had friends who moved to America. They had friends in Argentina. They had friends in Australia. I mean, they stayed in touch with all these friends. I remember every year for Shoshana, my mom would handwrite, New Year's cards, and so they had and then the first time I came to the States when I was 10 years old, we pretty much jumped from one friend to another. I don't think we stayed in a hotel because we visited with all their friends.
Sounds like a very wonderful life. Can you say something about how Lena was instrumental in finding and freeing your uncle?
Well, so she had studied German, so she was fluent in German, and she was working at the Polish embassy. There was an office that was looking for displaced persons. So that's what that office was doing. And so a mutual friend introduced my father to my mother, and using her contacts at the embassy, she was able to track down his brother.
Does the Yiddish library still exist in Paris?
Oh, of course, boy, does it ever. Yes.
It's an organization that we're very much supportive of as well. It's wonderful. Let's see. Was there a specific area where Jews and immigrants lived and congregated in France?
Yes, absolutely. So there's a neighborhood in Paris in the Marais called the Pletzel, and near the Rue des Rosiers, and that was a very important Jewish district when I was growing up. Now it's become more like boutiques, and it sort of lost a lot of its character. But that was a Jewish district near where my parents lived, near Place de la République. I mean, you could go down to the neighborhood cafe and hear people speak Yiddish when I was growing up. And then my father was a tailor, so he worked in Schmattes, and there was a whole area called the Sentier where there were a lot of other people working in the Schmattes business, and there were a lot of Jews there. So I think it may have morphed over the years, but yes.
Do your siblings speak Yiddish, or are they involved in Jewish life, Yiddish culture?
So my brother probably initially knew Yiddish better than either my sister or me, because when he was born, my parents didn't know French. So although he spent 1 year with a wet nurse, a French wet nurse, but I think when he was growing up, my parents, they always spoke Yiddish at home, and I think my mom even wanted to teach him Yiddish, how to write, but then the kindergarten teacher told her to speak French to him because, at the time, nobody believed in bilingual education. So then they switched to French. But I think my brother's Yiddish initially was better than ours. My sister just retired and she has gone back to studying Yiddish at the Maison de la Culture Yiddish in Paris. So all three of us certainly understand it very well. I think my brother can read it. I'm not sure, but my sister certainly can.
Curious to hear more about your own connections to and experiences with Yiddish, learning it, speaking it, working within it. And then they say, parenthetically, can't wait to read your mother's book.
Thank you. So as I say, I grew up with my parents speaking Yiddish at home. And I think for 1 year when I was about 10, I went to the worker circle, Sunday school, where I remember, learning how to write it and read it. And I think there was even like a Purim spiel where I played Queen Esther and I learned this little poem in Yiddish, but I didn't stick with it. Then when I was in high school, I'm not sure why actually, because I was a science major and I took Yiddish that I think in 12th grade with Rachel Hertel, and then again, nothing came out of it. And then I got my BA in English, and then I did my master's on Jewish American women writers, and I studied with Rachel Hertel, who also, taught Yiddish. And so she's the one who suggested that I could continue with studying, Jewish women writers in English and Jewish women writers in Yiddish. So I applied for a fellowship at YIVO, and I found an exchange program between my university and Hunter College. So I was based at Hunter, but I took one class at JTS with David Roskis, and I took classes at YIVO. I took Yiddish classes with Dan Miran, and so I think in a weird way, it was always about my mother, because I didn't really think that there was anything about, Jewish women writers in France. I don't think that was a topic that, existed at the time. And in a weird way, studying Jewish American women writers gave me sort of the necessary distance to be able to, study something that was very close to my heart, but with a little bit of distance. And actually, I remember sort of like reading, translating each chapter for my parents, because my parents actually did not know English. They knew 5 other languages, but not English. That one was mine. But I was very eager, to share with them what I was doing. I remember when I gave them to read Tilly Olsen, and in particular, Tell Me a Riddle, which my father was very, very struck by, and which my mom sort of like refused to engage with, which I found very ironic, because she kind of got dementia and lost herself, and I felt there were some parallels in there. And then Grace Paley, I wanted to share with them because it sounded so Hamish to me. And so, I started studying at YIVO. Then I found out that the Yiddish Book Center had this lovely, summer program. So I applied. And actually, I remember I found, and I would find all kinds of things in the piles. I found Maupassant in Yiddish, and I found, and one day I found O. Henry stories in Yiddish, and I was very excited. And I actually gave that book to my parents, and I said, look, you've been sharing your culture with me. Let me share American culture with you. And so when we emptied the apartment, we gave my parents' books to the French Yiddish library, and they found that one and they gave it back to me. They said, this one is autographed by you. You should have it. I can actually, I have it right here. I can show it to you. I think it's that one. Is it this one? Well, maybe it's not that one. Anyway, I found it and wanted to share it with my parents. So, but then, I studied for 2 years, and then I realized I didn't have enough Sitzfleisch or patience, to continue this PhD. And then I switched gears and I went to translation school, and then I fell into publishing. And yet I feel like, all these detours that I take have pretty much led me to this place. I feel like this has been such a logical place for me to end, because it was always about Jewish women writers. And also, I remember when I was studying Tilly Olson, she has this book called Silences, which is about how women very often couldn't have the careers, become writers, because of all the other things that they had to do, raise kids and earn money. And that again made me think of my mother. I think my mother was a classic case of somebody who wanted to be a writer, who at some level was a writer. Like, for instance, this notebook that I'm translating now, where she talks about her mother, there's some scenes that she rewrote 3 or 4 times. So it's clear that it's not just a memoir. There's a real intent at creating something. And so, and I think she was just too insecure. I mean, she could, I suppose, have taught Yiddish in the Yiddish schools in Paris. She never did. I don't really know what held her back. And she never showed us anything. My father hadn't read her diary until she got sick. So there's this paradox where part of me wants to honor her and feels happy to share her work with people. And part of me feels she would be mortified. She would never have wanted it done. So it's this sort of tension between honoring her by doing something she would never have wanted us to do.
Right.
So,
I think I'm going to leave it there for questions, because I think it takes us to a lot of places that this book has taken you personally and
yes.
opened up for all of us. So for all of you out there who are about to jump into the book for book club, you probably won't put it down. I read it in one evening. It's quite amazing. Dorothee, I want to thank you for the book, for the work that you're doing, for the work that is forthcoming, and for all that you bring to this conversation and broadening our understanding. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, and hope to see you back at the center again. It was nice to see you, albeit briefly, at Yidstock.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank our producer this evening, that's Jeff Hayes, the Yiddish Book Center's manager of publishing and book programs. For all of you out there who are book club members, Jeff is a familiar name, and now he's behind the scenes tonight. Thank you very much, Jeff. Tonight's program is presented as part of the Yiddish Book Center's Great Jewish Books Club, and part of our ongoing series of programs brought to you, as I like to say, live from the Yiddish Book Center. To see a full schedule of upcoming events and to register for any of our programs, visit yiddishbookcenter.org/events. I want to thank all of our members out there whose ongoing support makes all of our work possible. To learn how you can support the Yiddish Book Center through membership and other donations, visit yiddishbookcenter.org/donate. I look forward to welcoming you back for our next program in August. So check out the events calendar. Until then, enjoy summer, and we'll see you back here soon. Thanks.